verses 19 to 31. This may well be based on an Egyptian story, and it inspired Albert Schweitzer to build a hospital in Africa that became very famous, and it tells us we must not separate ourselves from the compassion of God. Starting at verse 19 of chapter 16, this is the common English version that Pastor Deborah recommends as a new translation. There was a certain rich man who clothed himself in purple and fine linen, and who feasted luxuriously every day. At his gate lay a certain poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. Lazarus longed to eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Instead, dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried by angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. While being tormented in the place of the dead, he looked up and saw Abraham at a distance with Lazarus at his side. He shouted, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am suffering in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, whereas Lazarus received terrible things. Now Lazarus is being comforted, and you are in great pain. Moreover, a great crevasse has been fixed between us and you. Those who wish to cross over from here to you cannot. Neither can anyone cross from there to us." The rich man said, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers. He needs to warn them so that they don't come to this place of agony." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They must listen to them." The rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will change their hearts and lives." Abraham said, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, then neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead." Dear Lord, help us to understand and live accordingly to this harsh passage, that your word may grow in us and our lives may give you praise in all that we say and do. Amen.
Thank you, John. So I preached on this text 3 years ago. This is one of the lectionary texts for this particular Sunday, and it comes up, this text, every 3 years, right around the end of September, early October, usually right before the stewardship campaigns start, which ours does next week. And so I preached on this exactly 3 years ago. Obviously, I wasn't preaching here because I have been here less than 2 years, but I was preaching at my previous church where Emily Bass was baptized, Lake Edge United Church of Christ. And I was, I felt at that time that I was to be reflecting with them about how we might see ourselves in the rich man. See, we were at that time, and I guess at this time too, we were a big church that was declining very rapidly in membership and in finances. We were completely homogeneous as a congregation. Between 300 to 400 people in that church. We had no people of color. We were very, very educated. We had a few brothers and sisters from the GLBTQ community, but most of us, if we were partnered and legally married in the eyes of Wisconsin and in the eyes of the federal government. And so in that context, I felt the Spirit stirring in me to reflect on how pastor and congregation needs to see themselves in the rich man. We were a congregation filled with privileged people. And we had, and myself included, every good preacher knows they preach the sermon they need to hear. we had the opportunity, the privilege to see things when we wanted to and to look away when it was too comfortable. And so I talked about the fact that we can step over Lazarus anytime we choose to and render him and his brothers and sisters invisible. And so I didn't lose my job after that sermon. But it felt really, really important at that point in time to put the mirror up in front of that congregation and pastor to see how we might be continuing to live into our privilege without ever reflecting on it. And I was prepared to preach that sermon this week. See, I think this is the UCC banner sermon, right? We always say we got to look first at ourselves and do the reflection, find where we have our unearned benefits of race, of sexual orientation, of gender, of class, and spend time trying to figure out how we benefit from that privilege and then how we can respond in the larger church. I heard that, my sermon and other sermons based on that. In some ways it didn't even matter what the passage was. But we as progressive Christians, and predominantly white, we like to talk about how we need to reflect. And I don't disagree. Obviously, I preached that sermon 3 years ago. But I couldn't make that sermon come out of my mouth this week. I couldn't find a way to preach that sermon at this particular time. I wish I could. It would have been an easier sermon because I've already preached it once before and I've heard it many other times. But I couldn't do this. I was reading this passage and I found myself growing more and more angry with the rich man. I found myself getting to the point where I was raging at him, having conversations with this rich man. I was struggling so hard with what he was doing in this story, his self-entitlement, his self-interest, that never disappeared in the course of this narrative. Everything that he does in this passage is self-serving. He dresses himself in the richest clothes and the most luxurious fabrics. He eats the best food. If he was here, he would send his servants to Whole Foods and buy all organic vegetables that he could buy. And when he died, and he's found himself in the world of the dead, that didn't stop his self-serving. Did you hear what he said? He sees Lazarus, and for the first time he calls him by name when he's in the arms of Father Abraham. And he says, Father Abraham, send Lazarus to me to dip his finger into water and quench my thirst. The nerve of the rich man. Send the man that I've stepped over in his suffering for years, the man who laid outside my gates and had a hunger so deep he couldn't move, and the only things that came to see how he was doing was the dogs that licked his swords. He had the nerve to ask Lazarus to come and to help him in his suffering. And Father Abraham, he entered into that conversation much more gently, maybe in the spirit of Heather, saying, but child, you had great things in this world, and Lazarus suffered greatly. But now he is being comforted, and you are in great pain. And besides, even if we wanted to, we couldn't cross this divide. So you're there and we're here. And then the rich man says, well then, send Lazarus to talk to my brothers so that they can't won't make their way into this place, into this torment. He only is thinking in that moment of people just like him. Go and save the other rich men who happen to still be alive. They will believe the prophets if Lazarus comes to them from the dead. No contrition in that man's heart. No reflection on how he missed the prophet's call. Not for his own salvation, but for the sake of God's vision for this world. And he certainly wasn't hearing it and sending it to his brothers. It was all about avoiding the punishment. I have been raging at this rich man. And I have tried to find myself in him because I believe that that's an important self-discipline. It is an important spiritual discipline for me to reflect on my privilege, and I have much. But I have decided that this time, I think I can say, I am not the rich man. I am not the rich man. I am not the rich man who believes that corporations are people.
Yeah.
I am not the rich man who spends millions of dollars to gut the Voting Rights Act and then millions more to quickly as possible, disenfranchise voters all over the country. I am not the rich man that wrote the Stand Your Ground laws and enforces them with disparity all over this country, in Florida and in Michigan. I am not the rich man. I am not the rich man who continues to consider same-gender couples as second-class citizens and will do anything they can to keep same-gender couples in that place. I am not the rich man who will deny as aggressively as possible health care for the poorest of the poor, for the children who are suffering in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti and on Pine Ridge Reservation. I am not the rich man. And I am not the rich man who is holding hostage our government right now, under the tail, now hear this, under the guise of health care being against their belief. And when it's really about making sure the first president of color fails, I am not the rich man. And you aren't either. In this moment, we can say loudly, in this moment, in this point in history, we have to stand up and say, we are not the rich man in this story. Because I wonder if we continue to hold the mirror up and look at ourselves and reflect on our own functioning, if we are not just using that as an excuse not to act.
Absolutely.
When does the mirror become paralysis?
Right. Absolutely.
We are not the rich man. And I have been raging all week. No tenderness of spirit in me this week. Been raging at the rich man. And the rich man who is in our world now, actively marginalizing people who are suffering, actively hurting those who are already disenfranchised, actively holding hostage all of us.
Right.
Under the pretense that they are Christian.
Oh.
I'm not giving the label Christian to those rich men. I am claiming it. And I'm setting aside the mirror right now, and I am ready to stand and to say out loud, we are Christians, and we care about the poor. We care about the victims of Stand Your Ground. We care about the children and the people on Pine Ridge. We care about same-gender couples. We care that all United States citizens get the right to vote. We care that we have a fair immigration policy. We are not the rich men, but we are Christians. Own it, proclaim it, be it.